This man is an honest and reliable police officer, and his name is Sub-Inspector Anand Narayanan. That day, he came to the police station because he was temporarily suspended due to a problem. Without any explanation for what had happened, the scene then flashed back to 8 months ago, when Anand was still serving as a police inspector at a police station. He would always handle all reports diligently, no matter how big or small they were, and that made the people respect him very much. To help with his work, Anand had colleagues who were also honest police officers, namely Sanan, Kabir, and Sukumaran. One day, a man named Mathan, accompanied by another man, came to report to the police station because his daughter Lovely had disappeared since yesterday. He explained that Lovely studied at Natakam University, and yesterday she went to campus to pick up her exam card. At first, Mathan thought that Lovely was studying with her college friends to prepare for the exam, but he waited until nightfall, and she never came home. Furthermore, when he asked Lovely's friends, they said that Lovely was indeed seen on campus, but they didn't have a study group that day. Upon hearing that, Anand was a bit surprised because there had never been a case of missing people in that village. Then, because Lovely always used a bus to go back and forth to her campus, they all ended up going to the place where Lovely usually waited for it, which was about 1 kilometer from Mathan's house. In front of the place was a stall. When they arrived there, Anand asked the owner of the stall, who explained that the other day, when Lovely got off the bus, there were 2 students from another campus who often hung out there, and the 2 teenagers were seen following her. After receiving that information, Anand and his colleagues all walked along Lovely's path home, and Anand took the time to imagine what happened to Lovely, suspecting that the 2 teenagers were trying to seduce Lovely. Soon, Anand found out that the teenager rented a house with his friend, and they often saw Lovely passing in front of their house. After that, the students who were previously seen following Lovely were all ordered to line up, and then the owner of the stall immediately told them who the 2 students who often hung out at his stall were. Then, the 2 students were immediately taken to the police station for interrogation. At the police station, these 2 students admitted that at that time, they were seducing Lovely. However, when a man with a bicycle passed by, they immediately left from there. Upon seeing the gestures of the 2, Anand knew that they were telling the truth, but he still ordered his men to look for the man with the bicycle to verify the 2 students' statements. Moreover, Anand suspected that Lovely might have been killed, so he ordered Sanan to search all the places around Lovely's path home. The next day, Anand came to Mathan's house to check the house, and there found out that Lovely was a religious girl who often came to the monastery. Then, Anand interrogated Lovely's mother, older sister Blessy, and her younger sister. From their statement, Lovely was only close to her siblings. Moreover, she did not have any friends around there and usually came home from campus at the latest at sunset. Next, Anand went to the monastery that Lovely often visited, which was only about 300 meters from her house, to ask the priest named Father Thomas whether Lovely had stopped by the monastery yesterday. However, the police were confronted by the congregation there because, according to them, a priest should not be interrogated at will. Without the slightest hesitation, Anand suddenly slapped one of the congregation members who continued to block him, and that caused a commotion to break out. However, in the end, they were broken up by Anand's superior, Superintendent Suresh. Not long after, Kabir came to inform them that a body had been found wrapped in a sack in an abandoned well nearby. This eventually ended their search because the body found was Lovely's body, and her hands were tied with torn blue cloth. Suresh, who was mad, returned to the police station and beat the 2 students to make them admit to the murder. However, Anand explained that a witness had given the testimony that Lovely walked past the students' rented house without incident, meaning the 2 were not the perpetrators. Nut still, Suresh thought that it was possible that the 2 students continued chasing Lovely after the witness passed by. Because this case was very sensitive, the person who would be responsible for the investigation was a police officer named Alex, and Anand was dismissed from the case. However, despite being warned not to continue his irrational investigation, Anand continued anyway, starting by making a plan around the house and also going back to explore the streets near the crime scene. Meanwhile, Alex arrived at the police station and had a private chat with Suresh. At that moment, Alex said that the police should not disturb Father Thomas because he was a good friend of the local officials. In addition, the 2 students who were arrested were children from wealthy families, and one of them was the nephew of a close relative of Alex. Therefore, Alex asked that the 2 students be released immediately. In short, Anand explained his analysis to Alex with a map that had been drawn, suggesting that it was possible that Lovely was not killed in the abandoned well, but somewhere when she was on her way home. Then, her body was thrown into a different well near the monastery and finally flowed to the abandoned well. He reasoned that the last time Lovely was seen was after passing the students' rented houses, and the distance from there to the abandoned well was about 500 meters, which was too far to carry her body without the residents seeing it. However, Alex ignored Annan's analysis and even threatened to ruin his career if he continued to investigate or disturb Father Thomas. It was clear that Annan could only hold his anger with Alex being so arrogant. Then, Alex continued his investigation with the help of a K9 unit. As they started, the dog was seen barking towards the monastery, and Annan became increasingly convinced that there was something strange about the place. Apart from that, the dog also barked at the house of a former thug who had repented. Upon returning to the police station, Alex gave Annan a report indicating that on the day Lovely was murdered, Father Thomas was out of town, meaning Annan didn't have to bother investigating the monastery that he had been suspicious of. After that, the witness was called, and Alex asked if he had ever seen the blue cloth around Mathen's house. With great confidence, the witness then answered that he had seen the cloth at the house of the former thug. So, armed with that information, the police went to the thug's house. When they asked about the cloth, the thug admitted that he lost that same piece of cloth 2 days ago, so he was immediately dragged to the police station. The man clearly got mad because he was treated very roughly and accused of things that were not true, just because he was a former thug. At the same time, Anand also felt sorry when he saw the thug's child crying as his father was taken away by the police. At the police station, the thug continued to be tortured, but he still claimed not to have committed the murder. Meanwhile, at the same time, at Mathen's house, a funeral for Lovely was held, and her body was buried after that. Then, in the evening, Mathen, accompanied by his neighbor, came to Anand's house to tell him that the thug the police arrested before knew Anand well, and that he couldn't possibly be the perpetrator. He also mentioned that his neighbor had seen Lovely enter the monastery on the day of the incident in the afternoon. With this, an important clue was obtained. Lovely was indeed last seen at the monastery. However, because Alex would not agree to an investigation at the monastery, Anand finally resorted to his own method, which was to order someone to pretend to steal at the monastery to catch Father Thomas's attention. Then, in the morning, he and his team took the thief to the monastery on the grounds that the thief had hit a patrol officer after his action and was immediately arrested. Because of this, the police team would have a reason to investigate the monastery to collect evidence of the theft. Thanks to this clever strategy, Anand cleverly managed to carry out a crime scene investigation there. In addition, Anand also conducted a crime scene investigation at the well near the monastery, and the findings at the 2 locations were immediately checked in the laboratory. Soon, once the results were out, the forensic doctor explained to Anand that he was very certain that Lovely had been murdered in the monastery because her skin tissue was found in the kitchen of the monastery, as well as some of her hair and fingerprints, which likely imply that she was struggling. However, what was also revealed was that there was a man's hair and fingerprints, as well as a woman's hair and fingerprints, which did not belong to Lovely. Upon hearing this explanation, Anand continued to process the crime scene at Mathen's house, and soon he knew who the other woman's hair belonged to. After that, he wrote about Lovely's case in detail from beginning to end, including his findings, and the file was given directly to the chief of police, Rajagopal, who was also an honest police officer. Anand also explained that during the investigation, he often went against protocol or orders from his superiors, but he continued to investigate to uncover the truth. Upon reading the files, Rajagopal was very shocked to know the facts, and he fully supported Anand. Then, thanks to Rajagopal's orders the next day, Anand and the police could bring Father Thomas to the station. Likewise, a woman was also arrested, and she confessed to all her actions. A few moments later, the regional police chief came because this case was widely reported, and the role of the regional police chief was very much needed for it. So Anand and Rajagopal explained about the case, including the discovery of the same woman's hair in 3 locations, namely in the monastery, the well near the monastery, and also in the house of the deceased. It turned out that the woman's hair belonged to Blessy, who was Lovely's older sister. The police now knew the chronology of the murder from Blessy's confession. Blessy explained that on the day Lovely was killed, Father Thomas's nephew, Danny, came from out of town to stay at the monastery. It was known that Danny had often stayed overnight like that every holiday because he would soon be ordained as a monastery priest. The next morning, Father Thomas went to attend a meeting with the other pastors, and it was at that time, when the monastery was empty, that Danny came to Lovely's house to have sex with Blessy, because they had secretly been in a relationship for quite a long time. However, in the afternoon, when Blessy was about to go home, Lovely returned home and caught Blessy with Danny. It turned out that Lovely already suspected their relationship, so she came to the monastery to confirm her suspicion. She then said that she would report this to her father and also to Father Thomas because Danny, who would soon become a priest, should be ashamed of that relationship. But then, the voice of the postman was heard, and the panicked Danny immediately dragged Lovely into the house. Blessy continued to monitor the situation from the window while Danny was still covering Lovely's mouth to stop her from screaming. Unfortunately, he covered her mouth a little too long, which ultimately resulted in Lovely's death due to suffocation. Upon knowing that, both Blessy and Danny panicked. Confused about what to do, they temporarily hid Lovely's body under the kitchen table. After that, Blessy went home with mixed feelings and had time to see the well near the monastery. Then, she felt anxious when eating with her parents and younger sister, who were also worried about Lovely not coming home. So, that night, Blessy left the house secretly and took the thug's blue cloth, which she happened to see, to tie Lovely's hands and feet, and at the same time, to frame the thug for Lovely's death. Next, Lovely's body was put in a sack and then thrown into the well near the monastery according to Blessy's advice. This finally resulted in Lovely's body being carried away by the current until it reached the abandoned well. Then, the next day, Father Thomas, who had returned to the monastery, did not find Danny there because he had returned to the city without saying goodbye. With his findings, Anand had received support from the chief of police, Rajagopal, and also the regional police chief. Then, with his main team, namely Sinan, Kabir, and Sukumaran, they finally caught Danny in the campus dormitory. Meanwhile, Father Thomas could only surrender to his nephew's fate. After that, Danny was detained in the cell under strict surveillance. He didn't want to eat and was very scared because he would soon be sentenced. The next morning, Danny was taken to court, which was filled with journalists and the monastery congregation who did not accept Danny's arrest. But suddenly, when he was about to enter the courtroom, Danny saw an opportunity and immediately pushed Anand and tried to run away. Anand, Sinan, Kabir, and Sukumaran immediately gave chase. At one point, Danny hid inside a rickshaw and then managed to escape to the train tracks, but tragically, he deliberately jumped onto the train track to end his life because he felt guilty and didn't want to spend his life in prison. After the death of Danny, the congregation of the monastery demonstrated and continued to corner the police, and that demonstration was covered by many journalists. According to the congregation, Anand and his 3 teammates were the ones who killed Danny. This led to the court giving sanctions to Anand, Sinan, Kabir, and Sukumaran, temporarily suspending them from the police force for a long period because they were deemed negligent, which resulted in Danny's death. In short, the story returned to the present, which was several months after Danny's death in 1994. It turns out that Rajagopal managed to convince many parties to reduce the sentence of Anand and his team as long as they investigated a murder case in a village which occurred 6 years ago, and the victim in that case was a woman named Sridevi. Since the incident occurred, the local police and the Central Bureau of Investigation, or the CBI, had not been able to find the perpetrator. Therefore, Rajagopal wanted Anand and his team to investigate the case thoroughly so that the public would respect and trust them again, knowing they might be able to work this out. However, because they were still suspended, Anand and his colleagues would work without the assistance of the police and without their uniforms. Upon hearing that order, Anand immediately accepted the task and discussed it with Sinan, Kabir, and Sukumaran. The 3 of them quickly agreed to investigate the case because they could move freely without having to follow the usual police rules. The next day, the villagers were already aware of the arrival of the new investigation team that would investigate Sridevi's death. This is where a sickening truth was revealed. It turns out that 6 years ago, when the local police were conducting an investigation, they often tortured residents physically and mentally, which the people would never forget, causing them trauma. Since then, they had hated the police and would never cooperate, and even the village chief, Pilo, warned residents to be brave enough to fight the new investigation team that would be sent there and not to provide any information regarding Sridevi's case. Pilo had learned that the 4 police officers sent were deemed brutal officers because they were accused of killing the suspect in the previous case, and the news had spread widely. In addition, a rich person there, namely Sadanandan, who had received awards from the state and was also a famous theater actor, said that residents must have a stance and should not simply obey the police's wishes. On the other hand, Anand and his team had arrived at the village, and after hearing the village chief's announcement earlier, Anand was not afraid, even though the villagers would now try to stop him, and he announced that he would continue to investigate the case until it was finished. Then, the four of them went to visit the house of the retired head constable, Ravindran. Fortunately, Ravindran had decided to cooperate, and he admitted that 6 years ago, the local police had indeed beaten the villagers. Not long after, Pilo and the residents came to warn the four that if the police tortured them again for information, the residents would not hesitate to kill Anand and his team. At that time, an argument happened, but Anand immediately broke up the confrontation and introduced himself. He also promised not to torture residents during the investigation and hoped that Sridevi's case could be resolved soon. However, Pilo did not simply believe this and continued to tell his citizens to be vigilant. After that, Ravindran accompanied Anand and his team to the residence they were about to occupy, and on their way, he told them about Sridevi's case. He explained that Sridevi's father had been violent towards his wife, Ravama, for years, which finally led Ravama to report him to the police. As a result, he was thrown out of the house, although he still lived in that village. Since then, Ravama has worked as a tailor to provide for Sridevi alone. On the other hand, Sridevi was a beautiful and elegant girl who loved to read romance novels. Thanks to her appearance, many village men had a crush on her, and one of them was a man named Sithu. However, Sridevi always refused these men, and people suspected that she already had a boyfriend, but no one knew who the man was. Then, one night, Sridevi wrote a letter to her mother saying that she had to leave home to live with the man she loved. However, the next morning, when Ravindran was on his way home, he was very shocked when he received a report that Sridevi had been found dead on a rubber plantation. The murder shocked the villagers, who had been living in peace, especially Ravama, who was very shocked to see her daughter's body. Not long after, Ravindran's superior came, and he would be responsible for investigating the case. Suddenly, he accused a man named Govindan as the perpetrator, because he was the one who found Sridevi's body first, and he also looked suspiciously scared. Not only that, but he also continued to torture Govindan and 10 other village teenagers, including Sethu, who had a crush on Sridevi, until someone confessed to the murder. Furthermore, Pilo was even removed from his position as the village chief just because he could not accept the police's brutality. What was shocking was that after Sridevi's body was autopsied, it was revealed that she was 3 months pregnant. Ravindran continued that the police gave a reward of 1,000 rupees to anyone who could provide information related to Sridevi's case. However, because none of the residents had any information, Govindan was accused again. Then, because he felt pressured and was always made the scapegoat, he eventually committed suicide behind his house. Since then, the villagers were furious and hated the police so much that they threw stones at Ravindran's house. Then, 6 months later, the government ordered the CBI to handle Sridevi's case, and Ravindran helped them gather information, which eventually led their investigation to a man named Parangodan, the owner of the rubber plantation where Sridevi's body was found. The CBI's suspicions arose because Parangodan was a lecherous man who liked to seduce women. Moreover, 6 years ago, in 1988, only 4 houses in the village had a TV, and one of them was Parangodan's house, where many children and teenagers watched together, including Sridevi. When Parangodan was interrogated, he claimed that he had gone to a relative's wedding on the night Sridevi was murdered. The police almost concluded that Parangodan was the killer, but when the fertility test was carried out, it turned out that Parangodan was impotent. Because of that, in the end he was released because he couldn't possibly have been the one who impregnated Sridevi. After that, the case was simply stopped because no more clues were found. After explaining the chronology of Sridevi's case, Ravindran said goodbye and went home, hoping that Anand and his team could solve the case. The next morning after breakfast, Anand and his colleagues went to Ravama's house, and during the interrogation, Ravama explained that she didn't know who Sridevi's lover was. After that, Anand and his colleagues checked the novels that Sridevi used to read often. At that moment, Sanan found an envelope tucked inside one of the novels sent by Sridevi's friend named Lekha when she was still working in Mumbai city. Armed with that information, Anand and Sanan went to Lekha's house, and Lekha confirmed that she used to work in Mumbai. She confessed that she and Sridevi used to send each other letters, and she remembered that in one of the letters, Sridevi had asked about life in the city and how she could find a job there. Then, before leaving, Anand asked Lekha to tell him any information she remembered, including about Sridevi's boyfriend, since he suspected that he must be related to the murder. After leaving Lekha's house, Anand explained his theory to Sinan that it was possible that Sridevi's boyfriend also worked in the same city as Lekha, and that was why Sridevi ran away from home and once sent a letter to Lekha asking about Mumbai because she wanted to live with her boyfriend there. After that, Anand and Sinan came to Pilo to ask who the village teenagers were who worked in the city. Fortunately, Pilo had complete records of the teenagers' data, but he clearly did not want to hand it over to Anand because, from the start, he did not want to help the police. Knowing Pilo wasn't going to cooperate, Sinan got emotional, but he was immediately calmed down by Anand, who invited him to just leave the office. The next morning, Anand went to visit the CBI officers who had investigated Sridevi's case 6 years ago and received new information. He found out that Sridevi's boyfriend was working out of town, and they often communicated via letters. However, during the investigation, when the CBI officer was going to interrogate the village's postman, Chandran, he found out that the postman had lost his memory after suffering an accident a few days after Sridevi was found dead, which left him in a coma for a very long time, causing his brain function to drastically decrease. Unfortunately, because this case had been going on for 6 years, no one knew where that postman was or what his condition was. Later, while thinking about how to retrieve the files in Pilo's office, Anand accidentally put a magnifying glass on top of Lekha's letter envelope that was sent to Sridevi, leading to him noticing a stamp with the city of Gurgaon written on it, even though Lekha said that she used to work in Mumbai. Then, when the letter was shown to Lekha, she admitted that she never wrote the letter and that the handwriting inside was not hers. Moreover, she also confirmed that she had never sent a letter in an envelope like that. After that, one by one, the mysteries began to be revealed. And to further help with the investigation, that night, Anand planned to take the files of the teenagers who worked outside the city 6 years ago in Pilo's office to find more clues. However, because the files had been moved by Pilo to his house, they had no other choice but to sneak in like thieves. Sinan, Kabir, and Sukumaran watched outside while Anand sneaked into the house through the roof tiles. However, Pilo soon caught him, but Anand easily grabbed the knife that Pilo was holding, and the situation instantly turned around. After that, Anand immediately took the file he was looking for and threatened to attack Pilo if he told the villagers about what happened that night. Because of that, the frightened Pilo promised to keep his mouth shut. Upon returning from Pilo's house and reading the file, Anand found out that the teenager who worked in the city of Gurgaon 6 years ago was the son of Sadanandan, the rich man and theater actor named Vishnu. So he quickly ordered his team to find out whether Vishnu was in the village or not on the day of Sridevi's murder, suspecting that Vishnu might be Sridevi's mysterious lover. The next morning, Anand met a resident who knew where the postman, Chandran, was. Not only that, but the resident also provided a little information that Sadanandan and his son Vishnu were seen as good people by the villagers. He explained that every year, Vishnu returned to the village to attend a festival which was always held in February, and that year, it was 3 months before Sridevi died, which was the same as her gestational age. Long story short, Anand finally met Chandran, and he was concerned because the man was now paralyzed in his legs. Chandran explained that after the accident, he fell into a coma for 2.5 years, but fortunately his memory had improved a lot, and he was sure that the accident was not intentionally caused by someone. Then, Anand started asking about the envelope he found 6 years ago, which was addressed to Sridevi. After getting a lot of clues and conducting an in-depth analysis, Anand met Pilo to return the file and tell him that he already knew the suspect in Sridevi's murder. So he asked Pilo to come tomorrow morning, because, as the village chief, he had to be a witness. The next morning, Pilo had arrived, and Anand had the opportunity to interrogate Sridevi's father, Rivama's ex-husband, who had repented and never caused any more trouble. Not long after, Sadanandan came, and Anand asked Ravindran to take him into the room. Then, Anand immediately explained that the perpetrator was not a young man, but an old man over 60 years old, and the old man was the father of Sridevi's mysterious lover. It turned out that Anand had communicated with Vishnu and recorded the conversation where Vishnu confessed that he was indeed Sridevi's boyfriend, but he never told anyone about it, not even his own parents, because they would definitely not approve it. He explained that he had known Sridevi since childhood, but their secret relationship started just a year ago when the teenagers in the village were doing community service. He said that he was fascinated by her beauty. They started chatting, and soon their relationship grew closer. But then, he decided to work outside the city to save money to live with Sridevi. He added that during their long-distance relationship, they often sent letters to each other, and he always used Lekha's name so that his parents in the village wouldn't find out. 8 months after Vishnu worked out of the village, he returned to the village to attend a festival in February 1988, and that was when they had sex. Then, 2 months later, he was very surprised because Sridevi sent him a letter and told him that she was pregnant. At that time, he was very panicked, and his roommate suggested he elope with Sridevi. So he wrote a letter to her to convey that idea, and they decided to meet in the village. After that, he and his friend stayed at a hotel near the village and waited overnight for Sridevi at the appointed location. However, because she never showed up, they decided to return to the hotel. But then, the next day, he received the news that Sridevi had been found dead, and his friend suggested they return to the city immediately to avoid being accused of the murder. After hearing the recording of the conversation, Sadanandan was panicked because Vishnu's voice sounded like the voice in the recording. Furthermore, Anand now suspected him as the prime suspect in Sridevi's murder. After that, Anand explained that his investigation had progressed this far because he had found many clues, including important information from Chandran, who always received and delivered Sridevi's letters. When the interrogation was over, Sadanandan was allowed to go home, as well as Pilo and Ravindran, who also returned to their respective homes. Anand then said that he deliberately let Sadanandan go because he did not have the authority to detain or arrest anyone since he wasn't investigating on behalf of the police. Therefore, he immediately asked Rajagopal to come to the village right away. Then, after he arrived and Anand explained all the results of the investigation in detail and who the real perpetrator was, Rajagopal agreed to allow the arrest of the perpetrator. They all finally went to the perpetrator's house. However, many residents were seen flocking up the hill because it turned out that the perpetrator had just been located up there. Shockingly, the real perpetrator was not Sadanandan but Ravindran, and he had decided to end his own life. Then, Rajagopal found the last letter written by Ravindran in his shirt pocket, and all his confessions were contained inside. It turned out that when Anand played the recorded voice of the conversation, Ravindran was very surprised because he knew very well that the voice was that of his son, Sudeep, not the voice of Vishnu, Sadanandan's son. The truth was, finally, revealed. It all started 6 years ago, when Chandran told him that there were letters that were often sent to Sudeep from the village. And upon seeing the contents, Ravindran was very surprised because it turned out that Sudeep had been dating Sridevi and had impregnated her. After finding out about it, he then gave the letter back to Narayanan to be sent as if it had never been opened before. But because of that, Ravindran forced Chandran to give him all the letters sent and received by Sridevi before sending or delivering them. It was from here that Ravindran realized that Sudeep always sent letters under Lekha's name. Soon, Ravindran found out that Sudeep intended to elope with Sridevi, and in the letter was written the date and location where Sudeep and Sridevi would meet. Armed with that information that night, Ravindran went to wait for Sridevi, who would definitely pass through the forest area, and upon seeing her, he immediately slammed her head against a tree until she died. After murdering Sridevi, he realized that sooner or later he would be caught. So he wrote all the confessions in a letter and decided to run away, because he felt ashamed of his actions and did not want people to see him as a criminal. It turned out that Anand had started to suspect Ravindran because there was vital information that Ravindran didn't tell him, which was the fact that the case was stopped when they found out that Chandran had an accident and was in a coma. This was different from Ravindran's confession, who said that the case was stopped when Parangodan was confirmed to be impotent. This implied that Ravindran did not want Anand and his team to find Chandran, who could be a key witness. Anand's suspicion was strengthened when he found out that Sudeep worked in New Delhi, which was less than an hour's travel time to Gurgaon, and it was common for workers in New Delhi to rent in Gurgaon to save money, meaning that Sudeep was also worthy of suspicion as Sridevi's lover because the address found on the envelope that was found was from Gurgaon. To confirm this, Anand went to Sadanandan's house to see whether Vishnu was the person he was looking for, and after matching the handwriting on the envelope with Vishnu's handwriting, he realized that it was different, meaning that Vishnu was not Sridevi's lover. Then, Anand asked Vishnu, who turned out to be Sudeep's good friend, to check whether the writing on the envelope matched Sudeep's handwriting. and soon he found out that Sudeep's handwriting was the same. In addition, when interrogating Chandran, he also admitted that he often gave the letters Sridevi received and sent to Ravindran first. With this information, the investigation narrowed down, especially when Vishnu finally informed Anand that Sudeep was willing to explain the truth. After hearing all of Sudeep's story, which he also recorded, Anand concluded that the main suspect was likely Ravindran. However, because it was still a speculation, and if Ravindran were interrogated directly, he would certainly be able to evade it. So Anand had the idea to conduct a fake interrogation by calling Sadanandan as a fake suspect while also presenting Ravindran there. At that moment, he then revealed all his findings to see how Ravindran would react. Moreover, he also asked Sadanandan to cooperate, especially since he was a theater person who was good at acting. Fortunately, Sadanandan was willing to help. Apparently, the method worked perfectly because Ravindran's face was very shocked and panicked when he heard Sudeep's voice on the recording. In conclusion, Ravindran's motive for the murder was that he did not want his son to marry Sridevi, who was considered lower in status, and he did not want his reputation ruined if people found out his son eloped with her after she became pregnant. Although Rajagopal praised and congratulated Anand and his team's performance, which again succeeded in solving the murder case, Anand, Sanan, Kabir, and Sukumaran looked disappointed. For them, the case failed to be fully handled because the suspect was not caught and tried in court. But Rajagopal recognized their abilities, and he believed that Anand and his team would be given other cases that may be more difficult to solve.